Paul Minnis is the professor emeritus at the University of Oklahoma, who's now living in Tucson and is a visiting scholar at the School of Anthropology at the University of Arizona. His research focuses on ethnobotany and archaeology of the US Southwest and Northwestern Mexico. He's published 14 books and numerous articles. You can learn more about his latest book, Famine Foods, The Plants We Eat to Survive, coming out here shortly by University of Arizona Press. We'll be putting links to that in your chat, along with a discount coupon the University of Arizona Press is giving for Osher members for 30% off any of the books through their website. And we'll put that all in your chat. But I am going to stop talking and let Paul take it over. Paul, this is your second presentation this year with us. We really appreciate having you back. And thank you again for sharing your passion and expertise with our audience.
My pleasure. Let's see if I can get this all hooked up first before. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming out on a nice day. It's about 73 degrees and sunny in Tucson, and I hope your weather is as nice. I hope you all are healthy and given the situation, as reasonably sane as possible. Giving the talk now is actually kind of interesting, because if I had given this almost exactly a year ago, it would have seemed like kind of an odd, unusual, not very important topic. But the last, if anything has taught us, this last year has taught us that things don't always work out the way we want. Think about a year ago what we think was going to happen in 2020, and all those plans went out the window. Human life and communities can sometimes be fragile, and one of the issues that through history that has caused the fragility of the human condition are food shortages, particularly famines, though their famines are not the only serious food shortage. In fact, I think you could probably suggest that almost all of your ancestors dealt with food shortages, and if they didn't deal with it correctly, you wouldn't be here. So I don't think this is a topic that's irrelevant. It's kind of obscure. There are probably 100 times the books on French cuisine than there are on famine foods, but that I don't think is a measure of how important the topic is. The title is A Starving Man Does Not Sniff His Food, Plants We Eat to Survive. And there's the book. It's coming out this spring. It's at the press it's at the printer right now, and I think it's not going to be out in April, but that's more or less about when it is. Now, when we think about famines, if you're in North America or Europe or wherever, most places, the one you think about is the Irish potato famine, or the Angorta Mór, which happened in the 1840s, and probably not an insignificant number of you who are listening are here because of the Irish potato famine. We know the story well enough. The Irish peasants became dependent on the potato. There was not much genetic diversity. Cold and rainy weather caused the bacterium or fungus, I can't remember which, to destroy the potatoes. It devastated Ireland. A million people died. 1 million people emigrated to places like North America and Australia and England. And Ireland really never, it took us over a century for Ireland to sort of get back to where it was. So it's one that's really famous. It's not the worst famine that ever existed, and it's not the only one that ever happened to Ireland, but it's one that we have a lot of historical records. It's one you probably are familiar with. Famines can be very lethal. Probably the worst modern famine, in fact, perhaps the worst famine on record, was the Great Leap Forward famine in China from 1958 to 1961. The estimates are 15 to 33 million people died. Estimates have gone as high as 45 million. There are various people who have made accumulated lists of famines, and for the 77 largest famines, that is since post 1860, the estimate is between almost 100 to 150 million people died. And another estimate suggests cumulative for the 20th century, around 75 million people died. And that's a fairly probably low estimate. This is not insignificant. It is really an existential problem for humanity. Famines are really common. They're not rare. Now, we in North America have been fortunate and haven't had to deal with that. In fact, we have to deal with too much food abundance. That's our problem. But famines in history and throughout the world have been a serious problem. And they are not evenly distributed. There are times and places where famines are particularly bad and other times they aren't. So Europe had early famines, and then by the 1600s, famines became much less rare unless they were caused by war. And I'm going to use the word famine foods, but really I want to talk about foods people eat when there are food shortages. And famines are the most famous and the one that people pay attention to. They're the most devastating, the most existentially threatening, but there are other kinds of food shortages that are awful. There are hunger seasons. Many societies have periods of time when there's really low food availability, and they have to deal with that. Sometimes they just don't eat as much, and they lose weight. The San, for example, lose about 10% of their body weight. There are also smaller scale famines that cause serious problems, but not to the level of the big famine. So it's a wide ranging problem. And because it's very common, I mean, there was 1928, some students at Nanking University estimated or cataloged what they thought was about 1,800 famines in Chinese history. These things occur, they're fairly common and they're widely spaced. And so you would expect if you had this really a problem, people had developed a large number of foods that they would eat to try to ameliorate or at least to survive these food shortages. So we'd expect a lot of these things out there. And the interest in famine foods goes back a long time. Galen, for example, wrote about people in the Asia Minor in the 2nd century AD, and we can read the quote: "They ate twigs, roots, and trees, bulbs and bushes and bulbs, and roots of indigestible plants. They filled themselves with wild herbs and cooked fresh grasses." And frankly, a lot of modern descriptions of famine foods mirror this. One of my favorite early ones is Zhuang Ben Cao, or the famine food remedy. And it was started by Prince Zuzu in late 1400s. His son took it over, and there are many different iterations. This is a picture from the 1593 edition of a lotus. He recognized 414 plants in China, and mostly Hunan province. And it was probably the most extensive and most impressive list of famine foods perhaps ever accumulated. It became the foundation for other groups. For example, Japanese famine food books are almost exclusively based on the Zhuang Ben Cao, and it is an amazing, amazing thing. There is an English translation that's quite remote, published in 1946, and you can just see an example, for example, of spiderwort, what the English translation would be like. The Chinese have reprinted 2 of these recently, and so there is some renewed interest in this book. So the point is, there is a lot of early interest, academic interest, and relief interest in what people ate. Well, for the book, I couldn't obviously cover the entire world. I took 14 case studies just to see. I had originally in 1991 published an article on famine foods used in the Southwest and Northwest Mexico. But I always wanted to get a broader perspective, and so I chose 14 case studies. And I divided up into 3 kinds: non-agricultural groups, hunters and gatherers, or foragers. For example, the circumpolar region, where plants actually aren't very important foods, but there are plant foods that were used during famines. The northwest coast of North America, which is incredibly interesting because, especially along the coast, there are high density populations, and they have a very unique set of famine foods. Australia is in a very interesting place. There are about 500 Aboriginal groups in Australia who've been living for tens of thousands of years, making a living off of without agriculture, modifying plants, but without agriculture in Australia. And then the iconic group in anthropology for hunters and gatherers and foragers, the San of Southern Africa. So we'll look at these 4 case studies to try to get a sense of what non-agricultural groups do. One of the major transformations in the human condition it happened about 10,000 years ago at the first, and then at various times after that, in various places, is the development of farming, crop domestication and farming, and the development of village life. This is 3 examples I use. There's the Southwest, for example. You can see Hopi right here in the upper right, and those little dots up there, that's Hopi village, and these are Hopi fields down here. And you can contrast that to the Gwembe Tonga of South Central Africa. And they are a very interesting study because they were living in their homelands. Their dam was being built on the Zambezi River, and 50,000 Gwembe Tonga were relocated out of their ancestral lands into upland areas. And as a part of that, people studied and what was going on and how they adapted to the new area. And then the third is Highland Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea, for anthropologists, is amazing. There are a lot of tribal groups that have minimal interaction with their national government. And so I looked at the Highland Papua New Guinea, and particularly the Fringe Enga. But most people live in nation states where there's large villages with peasants. There are complicated economies with specialization. There are urban populations. There's usually a strong hierarchy in politics and economics. And I looked at most of my case studies were those. I looked at three countries. The first, of course, would be Ireland. How could you not do the Irish potato famine? China has had a large number of famines and has had some research on famine foods. And then the other area is India, where again, there's a lot of population. There's a lot of historical records on famine food use. But a lot of the modern famines in nation states are due to war. And there are 4 examples I looked at. The first was the Dutch hunger winter of 1944. Just before the end of the World War II, the Dutch had a very serious famine, and about 25,000 people died. And it's a very interesting study in many ways. I also looked at Greece, had a couple of years of famines about the same time. The Siege of Leningrad. I wanted to look at the Siege of Stalingrad, but I couldn't get much information. But what happened? We all know the Siege of Leningrad was just a horrid event with massive death and destruction. And what did the people do when they were what did they eat? And so I looked at the Siege of Leningrad. There's actually some data on that. There is some analysis, and there are survivors' records. And then finally, kind of a weird little example, and that is the Australian, New Zealand, and US governments produced books about what foods are edible in the Pacific for sailors that get stranded on islands, or soldiers that get stranded on islands, or pilots, Air Force pilots that are have to bail out and they're in an environment they don't know what to eat. And so they put these books together, little books people could carry saying, this is what you eat. So they're not famine foods necessarily to the people that were living there, the indigenous people, but there was certainly famine foods for the people who the books were intended for. And so I looked at these 4 examples from World War II. There's some very interesting things to learn. Okay, so that's what I looked at. The question is, what do people eat in a famine? Now, there's a short answer. And if you got to go do something, here it is. They'll eat anything edible and many things that aren't. Things like pets, zoo animals, corn cobs, weeds, soil. Or as the Ukrainian adage is, a starving man does not sniff his food. That's the short answer. So if that's all you want to know, it was nice talking to you. There's a longer answer. And the longer answer is actually quite complicated and is contingent on the circumstances, the history of peoples, their environment, their social organization, what their economy is geared toward. So for example, in the Northwest coast of North America, which has an abundant amount of food, famine foods tend to be berries and inner bark, which is the same thing in the circumpolar area. In the circumpolar area, people live mostly on meat and fish. In fact, plants are generally not that big a part of the diet. But there are some plant foods, and what they basically eat are inner bark and berries. Whereas if you go to other groups, yeah, berries and bark aren't very important. For some of the Australian Aboriginal groups and for the San, resins tend to be a little more important, whereas in other examples, resins aren't very important. So there's a lot of variation or difference based on the history and the environment of the group. There's a problem in studying famine food, that is, what is a famine food? Are they foods eaten during shortages, or are they foods only eaten during food shortages? Now, you might think B is the best answer, but I think A is a better answer. Because as I'll show you in the next slide, there are a lot of different foods that people eat. And to understand what people do, how the strategies they take to feed themselves when there are food shortages are much wider than just simply the foods only eaten during food shortages. And this next slide should explain that. Here are various types of famine foods. First of all, the one that everybody knows about and the most common nowadays are relief supplies. That is, they're brought in by governments or charitable organizations to make up for local shortages. And relief supplies are by far the most important. They have saved millions of lives. But there's a problem with the relief supplies, and that is they can't always get to people. An example that's happening right now is Yemen. Because of the civil war and regional proxy war in Yemen, there are populations that are starving and they can't get relief supplies. So relief supplies can't always get to people, can't get to people at the right time, and can't get to people in the adequate amounts. So relief supplies are the foundation, but they aren't always successful. Increased or atypical use of crops. It's very common for agriculturalists to eat crops to eat what they normally have, but eat more of it until it's gone, or to eat them before they go bad. So, for example, both in Highland Papua New Guinea and among the Irish peasants, they just gorged on the potatoes before they rotted to inedibility. People can eat crops atypically. For example, if you normally eat mangoes, you'd eat them green. If you don't eat green corn, normally you could eat it green. You can eat bean leaves, and we'll talk more about corn cobs, eating corn cobs. And so crops are very important, but not always in the way that they're normally eaten. A very dangerous and sad famine food are seed stalks. When you get down to you eat the seed stalk, which is eating the future. Because if you don't have seed for the future, you just going to compound the problem. But you're not going to have a problem if you die. So seed stock is often one of the last things people eat, but they often do it when needed. Animal feed. There are foods that are given to animals that are normally fed to animals that if there's a shortage, people eat them. In the classical era, they would feed acorns to pigs. And when there was a famine, they would slaughter the pigs, eat the pigs, and then they'd eat the acorns because the pigs didn't eat them anymore. Agricultural refuse and byproducts. Actually, this is, I just talked about this, like corn cobs, bean leaves, squash leaves, things of that nature. Peelings that normally wouldn't be eaten, or in the Bengali famine of 1943, people would get the water that rice was cooked in, which they would normally just throw out, but they would eat it. Native plants known to be edible. Many societies, not including ours, know about what edible plants there are in the natural environment. And often these are eaten on a normal basis, but people often can expand what they eat, the kinds of native plants, and eat them in greater quantities. That's very, very common. Native plants that are known to barely be edible. These are the real famine foods, things people wouldn't eat unless they absolutely had to. And we can give you several examples of those later on. And then there are native plants that are unknown or mimics of known plants. And these are a very problematic category because you don't know, if you don't know what a plant, but you're going to eat it, it may have serious impact. There are lots of examples, and I talk about in a number of them in the book, where people either die or admitted to hospitals because they ate plants they didn't know were poisonous, or they ate plants that looked like something they were familiar with and knew was edible, but it turned out to be not that plant, but a poisonous plant. There are actually a lot of examples of that happening. And I can't see the last, oh, taboo foods, okay. There are foods that for cultural or religious reasons people will not normally eat. And there are many examples of people eating these things, breaking cultural or religious taboos, something that is not considered edible, for example. So if we were all starving, I'd be willing to bet if you're starving enough, you would eat insects or worms, even though we don't consider those as edible. They're tabooed by culture. But there are examples of, India's interesting example of foods in relationship to the caste system and whether high caste people would eat foods that normally they wouldn't eat. There are some examples where people died because they wouldn't eat it. And there are other examples where, you know, I'd rather eat it and break the taboo and survive. So there are lots of different famine foods. And you can see, this is why I think looking at foods that are eaten during shortages is a much more useful and more inclusive way of understanding what people do when there are shortages and what they eat than just looking at the category of plants only eaten during food shortages. They're really a small percentage of the kinds of foods people use. Well, let's put some tables together. I try to make them fairly simple. There's a guy in Tucson named Robert Freeman who has put a famine food database together with about 1,600 plants from 190 plant families that he's gotten from the literature. It's, by the way, online and hosted by Purdue University. Just Google famine foods, and when you get down to Purdue University, you can click it on. It's the most comprehensive database of famine foods, even though, and it's amazing what he has done, but it probably represents just a small fraction of the famine foods. And we can look at what kind of plant families. And here are these various families. Of the 190 families, most of them have one or two plants that are known as famine foods, but these are the families that have at least 20. And you can see that the bean family really stands out as being a locus for a family that's very important for famine foods. Sunflower family, grass family. In general, the larger families have more famine foods, but it isn't always the case. There are some large families with very few famine foods and vice versa. But it is interesting to point out of just this limited database that Robert Freeman put together, which is really, as I say, a spectacular database. He should be congratulated for the work he did. And I think he's still working on it. 40% of the 400 and something recognized plant families have at least one known famine food in this database. So famine foods are very broadly represented in the literature. Now, part of it is there are some things that aren't plants like mushrooms or fungus, and a lot of those are used as well. So famine foods are widely spaced. Some families, like the bean family, are overwhelmingly important, but they just aren't in one family. They're all over the place. And what kinds of parts tend to be eaten? Well, taking a 10% sample from Friedman's database, here are, from a worldwide sample, here are the parts. As you can see, fruits, leaves, and seeds are the most important. Bark is not that important overall, and shoots and stems aren't. And oddly enough, tubers and roots, which you think would be some of the most important famine foods, are much smaller. So really fruits and leaves and greens and seeds are the most important. But let me make the point I made before, and that is that this is a worldwide sample, that if you look at individual cases, there's tremendous differences. So if you look at the Northwest coast, bark and berries or fruits are the most important, and the other things aren't very important. And so this is why it's contingent on the local setting. And so while this is a guide to see what you might expect to find, it is not uniform throughout the world. Well, most people I think are from the Southwest here, or interested in the Southwest and Northwest Mexico. So I'll just give some examples from the Southwest just to flesh out a specific example. Unfortunately, a lot of these, when you look at the famine food studies, they fall into two categories. One is you have the historians and the social scientists tend to talk about what people did, and they talk about the famine foods, and they basically say they ate roots, seeds, grasses, leaves. And that's not very botanically useful. And unfortunately, a lot of botanical literature on famine foods tend to list the plant, but it doesn't say how they're used. And so you really need to kind of put both together. So in many cases here, I know what plant is recognized in the ethnobotany as a famine food, but don't know exactly how it was used. Well, cacti, not surprisingly, are very important. Now, cacti are eaten normally, but people can expand the use of cacti, and you would kind of expect that, since one of the things that famine foods need to do is to be available when other foods aren't. And cacti are well adapted to surviving. And here are just some of the various pictures of cacti. I'm not, prickly pear, for example, is probably one of the major famine foods. Choya fruits, maybe, things that wouldn't normally be eaten, but people will eat them. And even if they're normal rations, people will eat more of them. And not surprisingly, cacti are available because they actually survive very well in desert environments, and they'll be available year round, whether you want to eat them or not. And then there are various perennials, including underground parts. Things like jojoba, there is mesquite. Now, mesquite is an incredibly important food plant for many people in the southern part of the Southwest normally, but they can increase the use and they can eat the bean. Normally, people don't eat the beans. They pound them and get the powdery, sugary flour that's between the seeds, but you can't eat the seeds as a famine food if you need to. Oddly enough, underground parts aren't very important, or less important than I thought they would be. You would think that tubers are a good way for plants to survive droughts, and droughts would, you'd think, be one of the primary reasons why in the Southwest you would have food shortages, and yet underground parts don't seem to be that very important. Agaves and related plants. My favorite plants, agaves. People, especially in the southern Southwest, agaves are exceptionally important. Even the Hopi in the northern Southwest have an agave clan. And there are related plants like bear grass and yuccas, and they can be important famine foods because they, like cacti, are well adapted to drought conditions. They can, under certain circumstances, people can eat agaves they normally wouldn't eat, or eat them in atypical ways. And then weeds. A lot of greens and seeds. Now, weeds are something you wouldn't expect because they're mostly annuals, and normally when there's a drought, they just decide not to germinate. But weeds like amaranthus up here, or beeweed, or goosefoot, or purslane, or mentzelia, blazing star, are very, very important in the ethnographic literature of what famine foods are. And I'll explain why I think that anomaly is, why they're so important when you'd think that they wouldn't be in an area that would be subject to droughts. And then there's inner bark, the cambium or inner bark. It is some groups like the Western Apache would eat the cambium as a normal ration, but inner bark tends to be a very important famine food, and in food shortages, the use of the consumption of the inner bark is increased. Inner bark is actually pretty has pretty good calories, and so you would think that it may not just kind of be a slimy, googy mess that doesn't have many calories, but it's actually not bad. And so inner bark is used in upland areas of the Southwest, and in some areas like the circumpolar region and the northwest coast of North America. Inner bark is one of the major famine foods. And then you have other things up on the upper left is eelgrass. The seri, for example, will eat the seeds of eelgrass, which is the seagrass. It floats up on the beaches sometimes. And you can eat the pith of the palm. Palms aren't that common originally, but that's another odd kind of famine food. So there's a wide range. I think I recorded in the literature like 59 things recorded as famine foods in the Southwest. But what's missing, And one of the things that's missing is when you read ethnographic studies of famine foods among agriculturalists, and the ones we're largely talking about are agriculturists in the Southwest, what's missing are agricultural refuse and byproducts. It is so common for people, especially when they make bread, or to grind up corn cobs, which has, as it's used, grind up corn cobs have absolutely almost no nutritional value, but they extend breads. and bean leaves or squash leaves. These things are edible, and yet there's no record of that. And so the thing that sort of struck me as missing in the Southwest that you find elsewhere is the importance of agricultural refuse and byproducts, which are a famine food category, which is not necessarily great, but I'll talk about it in a minute how it might be better. Okay, so you have ethnographic description and historical descriptions. Now I'm an archaeologist, and I understand that people's lives change through time. And I would argue, and what I argued in the 1991 article I wrote on famine foods in the Southwest, that it changed. That the famine food, what we know today as famine foods, or what indigenous recorded by modern day or ethnographic indigenous groups in the Southwest as famine foods, aren't necessarily what were in the past. And it's based on the study of plant remains from archaeological sites. So if you look at the upper right, that is a prehistoric feces, a paleo feces, erroneously known as coprolites. And what wonderful data about telling you what people ate. What goes out is what came in. And I know this is going to be really exciting, but at the lower, I have to show you the picture at the lower right is probably the world's largest paleofecal research collection. Having taught at OU, I'm happy to say it's housed at Texas A&M University. So you look at and there are hundreds of feces found in cliff dwellings and other places in the Southwest. You can look at plant remains found in sites. You take soil from an archaeological site and you put it in water, like in the lower left, and you skim off the stuff that floats. That includes charred seeds and wood and other things. And that is an indirect indicator of what people ate. You also have other kinds of chemical isotopic studies. And I think what you tend to find is the things that are listed ethnographically as famine foods for indigenous groups in the Southwest were actually pretty common in the past. And there are two explanations for that. Well, three. One, we're wrong. Second of all, the second explanation is that the people were starving in the past at times. And I don't think that's correct, because the most common plant remains you find are corn. Now, people did, I think, have food shortages in the past, no question. But they also ate a lot of corn. In a lot of places where you get these things that are now known as famine foods, you get them in the same coprolite with a lot of corn. Or if you look at a sample from an archaeological site, you find charred corn and charred seeds from what would nowadays are known as famine foods. And so to me, the best explanation is the Spanish came in and the Spanish dramatically changed diet. They changed economy. They brought sheep and pigs and cattle and goats. And they brought all kinds of orchard plants. And they brought all kinds of crops which weren't in the Southwest. So, for example, chilies were not here prehistorically. And so they changed the economy greatly. They changed the way that people could use land. And my argument is because of these dramatic changes occurred since Spanish occupation, what were once commonly edible foods have now become known as famine foods. The point of that you can decide whether I'm right or wrong, but the point is famine food is not a static category. It not only changes through time, through space, that is, different people use different famine foods, but even the same people can use different famine foods depending on historical circumstances. You see this in reading about knowledge of famine foods nowadays, where in many communities, grandma and grandpa, particularly grandma, know what food they ate when there was a famine, but the kids don't, and the grandparents aren't telling the kids. And there have been so many changes, like in China and India and other places in Africa, that what were remembered as famine foods, that information is looked to be on the way out, to be lost. And again, that means there'll be changes in what people eat if there are future famines. So not only is different peoples important in terms of understanding different famine foods, but so is time. People don't stay the same, and that occurs for famine foods as well. Well, the question is, okay, that's all well and good, and obviously it could be that famine food scholarship isn't very important. I literally don't know of another book that's looked comparatively at famine food. So it's something that's been ignored, and I think it's too bad. But I think there are a variety of reasons why more work on famine foods is actually fairly important. And it's important besides the obvious point of feeding people who are starving. I think if we had a class here and I could see you, most of you, unless you were botanists or really are into foraging, wouldn't have a clue what to eat. If the grocery store is all emptied out tomorrow, you would be hard pressed because we have lost generally that kind of knowledge. So the obvious thing is famine foods, knowledge of famine foods, really have provided in the past, and let's hope they don't have to do it in the future, but I think it's quite likely they will, have helped people survive when other foods, main foods, aren't available. So here are some things where I think famine foods, study of famine foods is useful. And one is just to reimagine crops. These are the three sisters that we're all familiar with: corn, beans, and squash. And we think of corn, the kernels, we think of beans, the seeds, and we think of squash fruits and maybe squash blossoms if you're really into authentic Mexican food. But corn cobs. Anybody who's been a corn farmer knows how much cob there is. After you get rid of after you pull off all of the kernels, there's a lot of cob. Now, in many examples, especially where like Siege of Leningrad or other areas in India and China, people have ground up corn cobs and added them to bread to extend them. And one of the problems it has, if you do that, it has almost no nutritional value. It just fills you up without feeding you. But there are a possibility of being able to get a large amount of, or some nutrition, edible nutrition that's available to humans from corn cobs. There's a study in the proceedings in the National Academy of Science where they've been able to get edible cellulose out of corn cobs. And if that could be done in a way that indigenous peoples or local tribal groups or other communities could do, it would potentially help increase the food supply during food shortages when relief supplies are unavailable or not available at the right time and in the right quantities. Bean leaves are commonly eaten. So we think in terms of the seed, the beans, but let's reimagine and think under circumstances we might have to eat the bean leaves. Or squash. Squash leaves are like bean leaves, probably not that nutritious. I'm not sure what the nutritional profile is, but you find people eating those as well. So you have to think about reimagining crops. Same thing with cooking. There's a wonderful food composition book for Asia that gives hundreds of the nutritional composition, things like calories, fat, etc., minerals of foods. And one they also do is they include assays of parts that are thrown out. So like if you peel potatoes, you throw the peeling away, what is the nutritional value? And what's interesting, there's a lot of nutritional value there, maybe up to 30 to 40% of the value of the food that people primarily eat. And so maybe we need to broaden how we think about crops if we're having food shortages. How about new crops? Are any of those things that people don't eat or don't normally eat, can any of those become crops? You know, over the last 10 millennia since agriculture was developed, ancient farmers and modern farmers have developed probably thousands of crops, 3,000 or 4,000 crops, and things like 10,000 varieties of rice. And the scary irony that we all know is that right now the world is dependent on 10 to 12 plants. In fact, 3 plants, corn, wheat, and rice, provide the vast majority of food. So we've taken a great basket of diversity of foods and whittled it down to very little. And that's concerned people for 100 years. And people have gone out and tried to save seed stock. Every country, almost every country has a seed bank. The most famous one is the Doomsday Seed Bank in Norway, but they're all over. The ones there's a corn seed bank in the U.S. at Ames, Iowa, and the main seed bank is in Fort Collins, Colorado. But there are others. Tucson has one as well, Native Seed Search. And so people have been concerned about saving unknown or odd or not very well known seed varieties or crops. But it may well be that some of these food plants that are low preference foods might be amenable to domestication. And why? And so, for example, one of the reasons that people often don't use a food because it's bitter or it tastes terrible. And would that preclude it from being a crop? And my argument is probably not. Let's think about probably one of the most important tropical foods, and that is the Yucca Manioc or cassava, Manihot esculenta. There are two types. There's bitter and there's sweet. And the bitter has high concentrations of hydrocyanic acid that have to be removed before the root can be, or the starch in the root can be eaten. And so the fact that the bitter manioc is a poisonous plant has not stopped it from becoming a very important food plant in tropical areas, especially for poor people, because it produces huge quantities. And if it's a bitter manioc, it tends to keep insects away. It's sort of a built-in pesticide. And so if that can happen, it's not inconceivable that certain famine foods that aren't eaten because they taste bad might be amenable to processing and become crops. We can use all the crops we can get. We really are dependent on such a few number. It's really scary. It's so scary that governments throughout the world and private organizations are collecting the seed stock of these crops. And my argument is, boy, I might want to consider do any of these thousands and thousands of famine foods, any of those that we know are edible. They may have properties that might be useful and for domestication, maybe. And then by a cross-cultural study of famine foods, we learn about things that we wouldn't think would be famine foods or even edible. Now, all of you who live in the South, actually in Western North America, including up into Oregon, are familiar with this plant, goat's head or puncture vine. If you have a dog, walk barefoot, or have bicycles, you hate this plant. You can see the fruit has these really nasty spines. And you can vote, if you had to vote, what was the worst weed in Western North America? I think puncture vine or goat's head would win. But would it surprise you to know that this plant was one of the major famine foods in West Africa, India, and other parts of the world? It's hard to believe. First of all, the plant itself could be eaten like a green. In fact, it's surprisingly nutritious. And they even eat the fruits. You grind them up and to make a powder and then treat it like a flour. And so if we were starving to death in Tucson, Arizona, I don't think anybody would think about puncture vine as something that would be edible. But in fact, by looking at cross-cultural studies of famine foods, we see that this is actually an incredibly important food plant that has been saved probably tens of thousands, if not millions of lives, and is used throughout the old world as a food plant. And we wouldn't know that unless we actually looked at famine food use comparatively. All right, those of you in the Southeast are familiar with this lovely bean plant, kudzu. Kudzu, as you know, takes over buildings, highways, trees. It's an invasive weed, I think originally from Japan, if I remember, in the Southeast. And if you try to do any gardening in the Southeast, I'm sure you think that kudzu is just a horrible plant. But in fact, kudzu is a very important food plant in several areas, like Papua New Guinea. The starchy roots are one of the major food plants during food shortages. It also is used in Southeast Asia as well. And so we have these uses of famine food data, which is unexpected. The use of potentially looking at new crops, and in this case, learning about plants that are edible and that we wouldn't think otherwise would be. In fact, plants that we really dislike and think are just an absolute blight on the landscape, and they may be, but actually have a value. And in fact, I really would doubt that most foraging, I haven't looked at this, but books that deal with natural foraging in the Southwest area, it would actually talk about goat's head or puncture vine as an edible plant. And those books that talk about foraging in the Southeast, I haven't looked at, but I bet they don't talk about kudzu. Another plant is nettle, stinging nettles. Boy, that's a plant to stay away from if you're in the East or the Midwest. And yet stinging nettles in Europe has been, stinging nettles have been one of the most important food plants during food shortages. Now, the point is there's just a lot to be learned. Freeman's database is a fabulous database with 1,600. It's most comprehensive, and he spent an enormous amount of time, I think, almost as a hobby, to put this thing together, and he's still working on it. But it probably represents just a very, very small fraction of the number of famine foods that have been used. The Kew Garden has estimated there are 28,000, well, they know of 28,000 plants that have been used for medicine. And I don't know why you wouldn't expect at least equal number of famine foods. So let's say there are 28,000 famine foods. We know of about 1,600. There's a lot to be done. And it doesn't cost that much. It isn't high tech. It's mainly talking to people. And some of that information, I've argued that it's some of the information that's most easily lost. How do generations pass knowledge of what's famine foods? Common foods people eat all the time, and so kids see parents and grandparents collect them. But if famines don't happen but once every 10, 20, 30, 40 years, that knowledge could be lost through generations. I think it's quite likely going to be lost. And so we really need to go talk to survivors and groups throughout the world to try to understand what they eat, how they eat it, and how they prepare it. There's a wonderful study, probably the best study of famine food use by some Dutch in regard to the Dutch hunger famine of 1944. And they, through diaries and other written archival records, came up with this huge list of plants that were eaten. And then in 1970s, or what, 40 years after the famine, they talked to survivors who were older. And believe it or not, some of those plants were remembered. The survivors remembered them, but they didn't remember most of them. And so passing on oral knowledge of famine foods is fraught with loss. And that is, and particularly as the world increases in urbanization, people are becoming removed from the environments, the edible environments that they sustain their ancestors for long periods of time. They're going to lose that information. So we need to get it as quickly as possible. And it's quite inexpensive to get. So I see this is going to be done short, but basically the cliches: hope for the best, prepare for the worst, and learn from the past. Fit famine foods. As I say, I don't know. I know of an article, but I know no other book, comparative book on famine foods. And I think that is an indication that it really needs to be a lot of comparative work done, so we understand this obscure set of foods that have saved people for millennia, ever since people were people, and probably well before that. And we need to know that information, and it's not easy to get, but it's inexpensive to get. And so I'm hoping more and more people will take the time to get the comprehensive information. So with that, I will open it up to questions.
Thanks so much, Paul. We really appreciate that. And yes, if you have questions, please pose them through the chat, and we'll bring you on to answer or get your questions answered. Paul, just to start off, I was kind of curious, what, out of all your different pursuits and in the like, what led you to this topic and pursuing this?
Well, I dabble in ethnobotany and archaeology, and my dissertation was on the Mimbres area of southwest New Mexico, and from 1000 to 1130 AD, there was this fluorescence of ancient Pueblo people that made the most amazing pottery. And in 1130, things changed, and I was interested in thinking and I have a book on that too, if you really want to get bored, arguing that they were highly coordinated. They had this cult, but we now know this probably this cult that integrated people together. And during the Embrace time period, it was the climate was really good, and the population grew and expanded. And then 1130 hit, and the environment returned to its normal position. And because people were so closely integrated, when some people in outlying areas with less agriculture were having problems, it affected everybody, and the whole system sort of fell apart. And in that, then I was looked at, how do people focus on, what do they do when there's food shortages? And I then looked at Famine Foods and was surprised how little research there was. And I did an article in 1991 on Famine Foods at the Southwest, and I have wanted to get back. When I retired, I wanted to get back. So I got a couple other books out of the way that I had to get out of the way. And it was a great joy to get back to the subject that I found incredibly interesting. And I hope you do as well.
Great. Well, I'm going to bring on our first person, Jeff Yamauchi, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Oh, yeah, really interesting talk. Thank you. Yeah, I'm just curious, is this, I mean, famines, is this like a natural process in the, or is it like a human anomaly?
Famines usually are double component. They are usually some natural problem that are exacerbated by human action, or they're a human action exacerbated by a natural problem. And so they're usually both parts, not always. So for example, the Siege of Leningrad, the natural environment was rather, fluctuation in the natural environment were rather irrelevant. It was the German army blasting Leningrad away. Whereas some cases like the Fringenga in Papua New Guinea, frost, they were in highland areas, and they're susceptible to frost, and frost often kills their yams. And so that's primarily a natural problem. But, it's both. Usually most modern famines are a combination of natural factors as well as human action. And probably going to be with us. We thought famines were gone. And then if you look at World War II, 20 million people, as many people died of famine and related diseases as combatants died.
Our next question comes from Carrie Mukaida. If I'm probably destroying your name, I apologize. If you'd unmute yourself there and ask your question, Carrie.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. I was wondering if there are any seaweeds or other aquatic plants that were used for famine food, since that seems to be a large source of agriculture now. Aquaculture, yes. I should say.
Yes. Well, you saw the eelgrass,
yes,
which the Sarah used. But one of the really important famine foods during the Irish potato famine was seaweed. And people would collect it and eat it, and actually they even would bring it inland. So it wasn't just coastal areas in Ireland that ate seaweed, but seaweed became an important food source in famine food to inlands. And I'm sure there are plenty other examples. Interestingly enough, I don't know if there's a lot of things like that in the Arctic. Probably it's too cold. And I don't know about the Northwest coast. I don't remember that being there, but certainly Ireland, there's seaweed was a very important famine food.
Sorry about that, Carrie. I think I got you cut off there. No, it's very interesting. And I was kind of curious based on her question about sort of famines around ocean areas. Do you see them more often or less often because of the resources of the ocean? Are there?
No, I can't answer that. Nothing in what I read suggested it's either more common or less common. A lot of the ocean reef famine foods are in fact animals. If you look at the circumpolar area, they don't eat many plants, and what they normally eat are fish and sea mammals, unless it's talking about caribou inland. And the famine foods they use are almost all animal.
Okay.
So I can't think that there's any correlation I could see of of sea resources being, of plants at least, being particularly more abundant than land sources.
Okay. Our next question is Daniel Simpson. Daniel, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Thank you for a great talk. I had a couple of questions. One is, you had mentioned fungus, and I know that there's some toxicities associated with that and a few other things. Is cooking or heat source generally a good means of reducing toxicities?
That's out of my league. There's Tim Johns is a scholar who's focused on toxicity of plants, and you should look up Tim Johns' work. One of the more interesting uses of fungus is, of course, in the circumpolar area, where people would eat lichen and mosses that had been partly digested in caribou and reindeer stomachs, and whatever happens in their stomachs changes it so much that these plants can be eaten where normally they couldn't. Most of the fungus that are eaten are mushrooms. And so even in the Bosnian war in 1990s, mushrooms are actually an important famine food. And so, problem with, of course, mushrooms, you have to be really careful they aren't poisonous mushrooms. And in terms of how you might render them less toxic, I would stay away from that question. That's outside my competence. But if you want to understand toxicity in general and how people use various things like heat and fermentation to reduce toxicity, Tim Johns' research is probably the best place to start. You got another question?
We have a question from Frankie Harris. Frankie, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. I really enjoyed this. I'm from South Carolina, so I know all about kudzu, but I was writing a question to you about that goat's head,
Yes.
which I'm not familiar with, and I didn't hear what you said you could do with kudzu to make it edible.
Well, what people do is you could eat the plant itself, like a green.
Oh, okay.
And
raw.
evidently, it's been assayed, and evidently it actually is a pretty nutritious green. Also, what people do is they'll collect the nuts, those spine nuts, and they'll grind them up and make kind of like a flour. So they eat both things.
Okay, and so the goat's head question was, when they grind that fruit and it makes a flour, does it have any nutritional value, or is it like the corn cob, just a filler?
It has some nutritional value because it has a seed in it. And the seeds, obviously, as a young plant, have some stored nutrition that the plant's going to use, and the seed has, a little bit of protein and fat. So it's not fabulous, but a corn cob doesn't have a seed, and so it's just basically cellulose and a few other lignin and things like that. So goat's head is not fabulously nutritious, but it's evidently nutritious enough that people in 5 or 6 different areas of the world that I noted ate it.
They mix it with water and cook it like a pancake or something?
Well, I don't know. And this is one of the problems, that so many articles don't say how people specifically do it.
Oh, I see.
That's why in the preface I say, hey, this is not a how-to book. Don't eat it if you don't know how.
Okay.
Because they'll say what the plant is, but often they won't say how specifically it's used. And
Right.
and so and the other thing is, if they just list a plant, I don't know how it's used, because if it's a famine, it might be used in a non-traditional way. And
Right.
so you have to be very careful about the quality of the data and what it really means.
So asking you how seaweed would be prepared is not a good question. Okay.
No,
All
it's
right,
not a
well,
question I'm going to answer. I'm sure there are just lots of books about how to prepare seaweed. I mean,
okay.
it's eaten in a lot of cultures, and I'm sure there's quite a bit on how to prepare seaweed. But it's not something I particularly know enough about to say anything.
All right. Well, thank you so
Intelligent.
much. I appreciate you. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, and I realized I did cut off Daniel Simpson. I think you had another question, Daniel. If you want to pose that, go ahead.
I did have another question regarding some of the ancient population centers and I guess, potential botanical surveys for identifying famine plants at the periphery of that. Any work that you're aware of on that?
It's hard to do archaeologically. because it's hard to say exactly what is a famine food in the past. So that's a wonderful question. It's a wonderful topic, but it's an incredibly difficult one to do with the kind of data that we if you want to go to the historic past, you could look at classical records, for example, or Chinese texts or Indian texts, cultures that have written traditions going back thousands of years. And you can piece it together that way. So look at Rome. How was Rome versus the outer areas of the Roman Empire affected? And that would be probably a better way to do it. Archaeologically, it's an interesting question, but it's methodologically very difficult to do.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And we had another person on that said a person by the name of Green Dean has a great blog on edible plants in Florida and the Southeast called Eat the Weeds. So something people might look for if you.
Yeah, there are a lot of books on foraging. Yule Gibbons obviously is an early proponent of that in the 1960s. But there, for example, I think it's Timber Press has a whole series of 9 books on foraging all over North America. So there's a lot of foraging, and there's a lot of overlap between those books and Famine Foods, but the Famine Foods would, I think, be a much broader category than foraging. But foraging would be the first place to start and to get information on things that are edible in the environment. But they also, I don't think they would cover a lot of the more obscure famine foods like puncture vine.
And we have another question. They can't turn on their microphone. Ian Scott Parker is asking, under your advice on preparation, what steps can urban or post-industrial supply chain dependent societies do? And thank you for an interesting presentation.
Well, there's not much individuals can do, especially when you get urbanized populations. It almost always is highly organized relief. And depends on the situation. So in the Siege of Leningrad, people couldn't go out, individuals couldn't go out and forage because the German army and this Finnish army were surrounding Leningrad. So that didn't work, that wouldn't work. In the Dutch famine, actually people in urban areas would go out on hunger treks for sometimes weeks at a time. But mostly it seems to be, and I could be wrong with this, but the literature seems to suggest that they weren't so much foraging, but rather they were trading things with farmers. And that shouldn't be too surprising because, in Dutch winter, there's not going to be that much natural plants out there that are going to be available. What's interesting about the Dutch example that's unique is tulips. Tulip bulbs were a major famine food. Because of the importance of flower bulbs in the Dutch economy, and I presume during World War II you couldn't sell much of them, and so tulip bulbs and daffodil bulbs and others became a really important famine food. And there's an example where the history and the economy of a particular area really determined what the famine food. Nowhere else have I ever read tulip bulbs being used as a famine food, but they were very important for the Dutch because literally tens of thousands. I have a quote from tens of thousands of bulbs were prepared for food. I have one quote from a bulb wholesaler saying he sold 25,000 tons, I believe, of bulbs to be used, to be consumed. A nice little interesting, unique story that again points out how individual cases can be very unique, and the pattern that we tend to see broadly isn't always the same in all areas of famine food use.
I've got another question for you too. I noticed on your list of plants, there's a lot of plants that we'd consider ancient grains by today's standards. I guess, is that because they came out of studies from archaeological sites, or is that something that you find even these grains in more recent famines?
A lot of, there are something like 10,000 varieties of rice. There are at least 1,000 or 2,000 varieties of wheat, probably 300 or more varieties of corn that were developed by indigenous peoples. And a lot of those still exist. That if you go into remote areas, some of those still are being used. And so when you get industrial agriculture, they tend to use just certain varieties. But if you look in rural areas with indigenous and local groups, often a lot of these obscure, what we would consider ancient varieties are still being grown. And there has been a great amount of effort, not sufficient, but a great amount of effort to record and to gather the seed stock and maintain it in case we need to use it. So, for example, when I was down in Chiapas doing some archaeological work in Chiapas, I picked up in a market something called the escuintla bean, which is the same thing as the tepary bean, which is found in the Southwest. It's very drought resistant, and it's really a small but a tasty bean. And it's in the Southwest. You probably have had it. It's very tasty. And there's a little bit of it that grows down in the coast of Mexico and Guatemala. It's just odd. And I collected some of it and sent it off to one of the repositories. And I got a note saying from somebody asking more about it because they were using it to develop, to try to increase resistance to some blight on a common bean. They're using the genetics from that. So you never know where any of these obscure things might be useful, but certainly it's a part of the incredibly important part of the human heritage that everybody has recognized as being really important. And they don't so much come out of archaeological studies, though they mostly come out of people going and looking at rural communities that still maintain traditional lifeways. There are some archaeological examples. Any of you are in the Sonoran Desert, archaeologists, Paul and Susie Fish in particular, have demonstrated that the prehistoric peoples, the Hohokam, grew cultivated agave, which we didn't know exists because it became extinct. And so I got another book called New Lives for Ancient Extinct Crops that looks at this question. And so the archaeology plays a small part, but I think not an insignificant part of documenting the range of variation in crops.
Well, Paul, I think unless anybody else has other questions, that we've kind of run the course with that. But
my apology, it was so short. I'll go ahead and just read scientific names if you'd like for 20 minutes.
No, you did wonderful job. So tell me what are your next projects you have brewing? You always seem to have many things going on.
Well, my colleague and I did basic archaeological work in Chihuahua for 20 years, and we've published 3 books on it and a bunch of articles, and we have one more book we have to do. And I have a couple of chapters I need to get on that. And then after that, I have several possibilities, or I may decide to sit on a couch and watch TV for the rest of my life.
Well, that all sounds fun anyway. I'm going to put...
if we survive.
That's right. And for those who may have joined us late, I've just put in the chat, I apologize, the first letter got cut off there for some reason. Famine Foods, Plants We Eat to Survive is his latest book. It is available through UAPress website, and the link is there along with a special 30% off code. The book is not out yet, but it's coming from the printer, and it looks like it may be available as soon as the beginning of March from the UAPress's website anyway. But you can,
it's cheap.
You can pre-order it, and it would be great.
And it's cheap. And it's cheap.
It's cheap. We like cheap. Well, one other question, I guess, that came to mind for me in this topic was just the nutritional value. Has anybody kind of done anything to then rank all this food in terms of what would be the most nutritional for people to sustain them to least, or is it just too situational because of where people are at?
People have taken specific plants that have been used as famine foods and done nutritional assays of them. And, in general, they aren't as nutritious as the regular foods that people eat. But, when you're starving, any food is better than no food.
Sure. As
long as it's not deleterious to your health. So there are, in certain areas, people have, particularly Australia and the San and other areas, there have been nutritional assays of traditional foods, including some famine foods.
Very good. Well, Paul, we want to thank you again for joining us and for your second presentation with us this year. So we really appreciate everybody joining us from around the country, as well as our local Tucson members from Osher. So thank you for that. And Ian Scott Parker says, grow beans. So thank you all so much. Have a great week at Ollie, and we'll see you back for our speakers.
And stay safe and sane.
We'll do that. And you too, Paul.
All
Take
righty.
care. Thank you so much, everybody. And we'll see you next week.